Good evening, I'm Joy Reid in for Chris Matthews. And leading off tonight, the final seconds. What happened in the last moments before the shooting death of Trayvon Martin? In court today, one of George Zimmerman's neighbors, John Good, said he heard what sounded like a fight that night and stepped outside his townhouse to see what was going on. What he saw, according to the neighbor, was what appeared to be Zimmerman lying on his back with Trayvon Martin straddling and punching him. He used a mixed martial arts term, ground and pound, to describe what Martin was doing. Good also testified that there was a call for help, likely from the man at the bottom, who he believed was Zimmerman. Now, that was different from the testimony we heard from another neighbor yesterday, who thought it was Zimmerman who was on top. And joining us now, a Rise News legal contributor, Seema Iyer, criminal defense attorney Joseph Haynes Davis, former federal prosecutor Kendall Coffey, and criminal defense attorney Dana Swickle. All right, let's get into this question of who was on top. Seema, yesterday we had testimony from a neighbor, a woman who they played back her very tearful 911 call, and she testified that she thought the bigger man, the larger man, meaning George Zimmerman, was on top. Today you have John Good testifying that he thinks it was George Zimmerman. Does this speak, that it was George Zimmerman on the bottom? Is it a wash?
No, it's not. And what I don't understand is, don't people realize that during the wrestling they could have switched positions? Why isn't this being brought out? And I think it's a reasonable explanation for the differing statements.
Right. And Kendall, that is a good point, because John Good testified that he saw only about 10 seconds of the fight that was taking place. And so you do have these sort of canceling one another out questions about who was on top. But why would the prosecution call a witness, in this case of Mr. Good, who seems to be backing up the defense's contention that Zimmerman was the one on the bottom of the struggle, at least at a certain point?
Well, the prosecution knew this witness was going to be testifying. They obviously knew it wasn't going to be helpful for them. They very wisely put him in their case, kind of in the middle of it, so that he doesn't become the critical showpiece part of the defense case later on. Accomplishes a couple things. First of all, the prosecution isn't hiding anybody. That's valuable. Second, though, he's somewhat in the middle of it. The prosecution is hoping that as other things happen, the jury's going to spend less time thinking about this witness, because one thing's for sure: if during the verdict and the time of the deliberations for the verdict, if the jury keeps asking for the testimony to be read back to them of this witness, that's not a good sign for the prosecution.
Okay, really just quickly, I want to play John Good's 911 call, or at least part of it, so our viewers can take a listen. Go ahead.
And you can hear somebody yelling for help?
I'm pretty sure the guy's dead out here. Holy.
Okay, we have several people calling in also. Anything else that you heard?
No, the guy yelling help. Oh my God. No, there's a guy with a flashlight in the backyard now.
Okay.
I think there's flashlights and there's a guy.
Okay.
I don't know if that's a cop. Oh my God.
Okay, I have several calls, and you just heard, did you hear when you heard voices? It was just one person talking, right?
There's two guys. There's two guys in the backyard with flashlights.
Okay.
And there's a black guy down that looks like he's been shot and he's dead.
Okay.
He's laying, and there's multiple people calling right now, I'm thinking.
Okay. I have several officers going out there, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Okay, and now I want you guys to take a look at another piece of sound from John Good. And this is where it gets a little bit murkier. This is when he's attempting to describe who was hitting whom. So let's see if we have that sound about who was punching who in that fight.
Now let's go to this case that night that you saw. The person who you now know to be Trayvon Martin was on top, correct?
Correct.
And he was the one who was raining blows down on the person on the bottom, George Zimmerman, right?
That's what it looked like.
Okay.
Correct.
Now, and I said a moment ago you were literal because you couldn't actually see fist hit face, right?
No.
Because it was blocked by what?
I didn't say it was blocked. I said it was dark out.
Now, defense attorney Mark O'Mara also asked Good about who he thought was yelling. Here's that sound.
Do you think that it was the person on the bottom who was screaming for help?
Rationally thinking, I would think so.
Okay. Matter of fact, I think you said in response to Mr. Delarounde's question, had it been Trayvon Martin screaming for help, since his back was to you, it would have had to be going, the yell would be going away from you, and I think you said it would have to bounce off the wall before you heard it.
I think it would sound different.
Okay.
That's why in my head I thought it was coming from the person on the bottom.
Now, Joseph, I want to ask you about that because it sounds like he's a logical inference. That's what it could have been based on the position that he saw Trayvon Martin in. He did not say the words, "I'm sure I heard that it was the guy on the bottom, Zimmerman, screaming for help." And Mark O'Mara seemed to be trying to lead him there, but he didn't get him there.
Yeah, and plus you have to remember, I mean, that night it was raining, it was dark, it's a tussle, it's a fight. It's a rumble, as we say. So that witness did the best he could. I remember him testifying that his wife didn't really want him to go outside. So he didn't want to go outside. He was doing the best he could to recollect as to what was going on. The other thing I want to point out, that also contradicts the young lady from Miami who worked for the construction company who testified at the end of the day before, which was yesterday, of course, that by and through an interpreter, that all she could see was red and black or something red and dark, and I'm paraphrasing her, because, and she saw that on top. In other words, that would lead one to believe that she may have seen Mr. Zimmerman on top. And again, sometimes when testimony is being conducted through an interpreter, some communications can be misconstrued.
And Dana Swickle, the other thing about John Good, although he did sort of on the first blush appear to be better for the defense, he testified to what he thought were punches being thrown. But the defense has all along made the claim that Trayvon Martin was straddling George Zimmerman and banging his head into the ground. We still have not heard any witness so far in these 2 days of testimony say that they saw that. Is that a problem for the defense?
I don't think so, because when you listen to what he was saying today, the pound and, the ground and pound, and that he saw his back facing him and he believed George Zimmerman was on the bottom. And then you look at George Zimmerman's injuries that are consistent with what that sounds like. Here, if you recall those photos of George Zimmerman's head, they look like he got scratches on the back of his head. One could think that it was when his head was being pounded against the ground. That's what it looked like. It didn't look like someone punched him in the head. It looked like something dug into the back of his head, scratched his head, and that's why the blood was dripping down, and there wasn't a big punch mark or big bruise or swelling like one would get when it was hit. So I think the injuries, if they tie it together, they pull it together with the injuries and the consistency of the injuries with what one could believe took place, I think it's fine.
Well, except for here's the problem with that, Dana, because today we had Lindsay Fulgate, who's the person who actually treated George Zimmerman, and she didn't quite say what you said. She testified to only seeing small contusions, 2 small contusions, and I think the prosecution, Seema, maybe you can respond to this, was pretty effective in arguing that that certainly didn't look like life-threatening injuries.
And they weren't life-threatening injuries, because if they were life-threatening, he would have gone to the hospital right away. If they were life-threatening, then he would have displayed some other physical signs that would have caused him to go back for medical care.
Okay, and just to reinforce that, let's play Lindsay Fulgate testifying, just a little bit of her testifying today about what injuries she saw on George Zimmerman the day after the shooting death of Trayvon Martin.
Based on your observations and review of those lacerations, did you feel there was anything additional that needed to be done regarding those, like any kind of stitches or anything like that?
That determination is based on how well the skin edges are what we call approximated, which means how well are they together to begin with, and how deep is the laceration itself. Based off of the approximation of the skin margins and the depth of the lacerations, I did not feel that sutures were necessary.
Okay, and later defense attorney Mark O'Mara used photos to ask Fulgate about the severity of the head wounds.
Do you see an area up here that seems to be misshapen?
In the photograph, yes, I see that.
Okay. Would that also be an area of swelling?
It's normally an area of swelling. We call those scalp hematomas, where blood can pool under the skin.
Tell me how that occurs. How does a scalp hematoma occur?
A hematoma can occur through trauma, so some sort of trauma to the head that resulted in the collection of blood there or fluid there.
So Dana, no sutures, 2 lacerations, potential for it to be caused by head trauma, but that doesn't sound like what you were describing as injuries that were so grave that they could have resulted in death. It doesn't seem that this witness who treated him backed that up.
But that's not what I said. You had asked me, does the injuries or was there pounding, were they able to prove that he was pounding his head against the ground?
And that's what she didn't seem to reinforce.
Yeah, but you have to also understand that there was also punching to the face as well. He had a huge broken nose, blood coming out of there. Listen, it's not a matter of did the injuries cause him to believe that he was in grave death. It was a combination of everything taken on into consideration. It's a total package. If someone is on top of you, they're pounding you in the face, they're taking their head and they're pounding your head into the ground. Sure, there may not be huge injuries on the back of his head, but if someone is punching him in the face and pounding him in the ground, you look at that as a whole, not just the individual injuries themselves.
Okay, so Dana obviously is buying into the entire theory of the defense here, but Kendall, did you have a different view, or Seema, did you have a different view?
I am a defense attorney.
but I think what Dana is trying to say is that at least the injuries on the back of Mr. Zimmerman's head are consistent with his story. So I think that's what Dana is getting to. And I think also what Dana is trying to illustrate for the viewers is that these elements go to the self-defense charge and what the defense has to show to get that charge submitted to the jury.
And Kendall, what's your response to that? If the person who treated George Zimmerman essentially testified to injuries that are real, that she did actually see injuries, she did treat them, but she's not testifying to anything more than, no stitches, 2 contusions, is that helpful at the end to proving a self-defense claim?
Well, let's combine it with the fact that Zimmerman didn't go to the hospital on the critical night of the shooting. So hard to think that he really thinks he was anywhere near death. And was he facing serious bodily injury? Not so sure. He goes in the next day. He doesn't need stitches for the contusions to the back of his head. And let's not lose sight of, we're looking at injuries. Yeah, he was injured, but he's a guy who took a gun and put to the chest of an unarmed person and shot and killed him. So when the jury balances out Zimmerman's injury, they're going to see there was a fight. They're going to see, Zimmerman was getting hurt a little bit, but he killed a guy. And is that enough injury enough to justify self-defense? I don't think the defense is there yet. They scored some points today, but I certainly don't think they're out of the woods. Okay, well, on that note, we will be back with the panel to talk about Rachel Jeantel's testimony and the role race and culture are playing in how people reacted to it. This is Hardball, the place for politics.